The floor stones bit into Kira's knees like frozen teeth. Her hands moved in practice circles, scrubbing away ale stains and boot prints from the tavern floor. Yet her mind kept drifting to the strange dreams whispers in a voice that felt ancient and otherworldly, speaking of wolves and shadows she couldn't understand. "Move faster, girl," the innkeeper's wife barked from behind the bar. "Those merchants won't wait for their supper." Kira's shoulders burned from hours of work, but she kept scrubbing. Soon after the sun had risen, she'd been pulling weeds from the herb garden. Next came hauling water from the well. From there, it was endless washing, sweeping, serving. Still, she was grateful for the work. Even so, the coin barely bought enough bread to survive another week. "Did you hear?" A merchant's voice cut through the tavern's din. "The Alpha King's calling for Omegas. War camp needs servants." Kira's hand stilled on the brush. Despite her efforts to ignore them, the conversations always found her. "Poor bastards," another man laughed. "Rather face enemy claws than Queen Mother Liana's tongue." More importantly, Kira had heard the stories. In fact, everyone whispered about the Alpha King's mother and her hatred of Omegas. Not only that, but rumor claimed she'd sworn no Omega would ever bear royal blood again. What's worse, recruitment meant anyone could be taken. Her chest tightened as fragments of last night's dream surfaced, that strange voice whispering about a silent wolf and destiny. Moments later, she'd woken in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. By the time she looked up from her scrubbing, the tavern had fallen silent. A figure in royal colors filled the doorway, his presence commanding instant attention. Eventually, his gaze swept the room with military precision. "Omega conscription for Ironhold Valley," the messenger announced. "All Omegas of age are to report to Elder Matthias by dawn." Truth be told, Kira had known this day would come. No matter how hard she tried to stay invisible, Omega conscription swept through border villages like wildfire. Maybe it was fate that Thornwick's turn had finally arrived. The messenger's eyes didn't linger on her, she was just another face in the crowd. Without warning, the reality hit her like a physical blow. In that moment, Kira's ordinary world began to crack. Her body moved on instinct as conversations slowly resumed around her. Without thinking, she returned to scrubbing, though her hands trembled now. As the silence stretched in her mind, one thought echoed repeatedly. She was about to become just another disposable body in the Alpha King's war. Kira's tiny cottage felt like a tomb. Her few possessions lay scattered across the straw mattress, a worn cloak, 2 faded dresses, and the small wooden wolf her father had carved before his death. Between one breath and the next, her entire worthless life fit into a cloth sack. "Kira?" Elder Matthias's voice drifted through her thin door. Before she could respond, he entered without invitation. In the echo of his footsteps, she heard the weight of official business. "The royal command sent specific instructions," he said, settling his bulk onto her only chair. As if fate demanded one final humiliation, even this conversation would happen in her pathetic hovel. Under the weight of his stare, Kira clutched her father's carving tighter. While dread pooled in her stomach, she waited for whatever blow was coming. They needed someone for the command area. Elder Matthias continued. "Someone. Unremarkable. No family connections, no political ties. Someone who can blend into shadows and cause no trouble." As the truth unraveled in his words, Kira felt something die inside her chest. Between her parents' death and now, she'd tried so hard to be useful, to matter somehow. Something inside her crumbled completely. With a single breath, she understood her true worth nothing. As if summoned by cruel irony, she was perfect for this assignment because she was forgettable. The tension in the room felt suffocating. When Elder Matthias spoke again, his tone carried false kindness. "You were the obvious choice, child. Clean, quiet, invisible." As her world tilted toward despair, Kira managed to nod. A beat later, she realized he meant it as reassurance. With the wooden wolf cutting into her palm, she forced words past the lump in her throat. "I understand." As something cold bloomed beneath her skin, Elder Matthias rose to leave. The air thickened with his satisfaction, another unpleasant task completed. Time stood still after he left. Her breath caught on a sob she refused to release. The space between hope and hopelessness burned in her chest. Her bones seemed to ache with the weight of being nobody special. In the quiet that followed, that strange dream voice whispered again, The silent wolf awaits. As the echo faded, Kira wondered if even the moon goddess's attention was just another cruel joke. Her name felt hollow in her own mind. In the stillness of approaching dawn, she shouldered her pack and stepped toward a fate that would use her precisely because she didn't matter. The war camp hit Kira like a slap across the face. Ironhold Valley sprawled before her, a maze of hide tents and wooden structures that reeked of sweat, smoke, and barely contained violence. The air thickened with power dynamics she'd never experienced, making every breath feel like trespassing. Her heart hammered as the wagon stopped near a cluster of supply tents. Time stood still while she climbed down with shaking legs. Her breath caught at the sheer size of the werewolves moving around her alphas whose presence demanded submission, betas scurrying to avoid their attention. The space between safety and danger burned in every direction. "New Omega," a gruff beta called out, approaching with a ledger. His eyes barely flicked over her before dismissing her as unimportant. "Name? Kira Ashworth." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. In the quiet that followed, he scratched something on parchment. Her thoughts spun as she realized she was just another line item in his records. As the echo of voices faded around them, the beta jerked his head toward a massive black tent in the distance. Her name might as well have been Nobody for all the attention he paid. "Command area. Keep your head down, mouth shut." In the stillness that followed his words, Kira glimpsed her immediate future in visible servitude. Her bones seemed to remember Elder Matthias's words about being unremarkable. As she shouldered her pack, movement caught her eye. A massive black wolf prowled the camp's perimeter, larger than any creature she'd ever seen. Her soul answered with inexplicable recognition, even as terror flooded her veins. The wind carried whispers from nearby soldiers, fragments about the Alpha King's legendary wolf and how it had been strangely quiet lately. Shadows danced between them as understanding hit her. That was him, the Alpha King. As though fate whispered a warning, the wolf's head turned in her direction. Her instincts surged with something she couldn't name, not quite fear, not quite recognition. A heartbeat later, the wolf was gone, and she felt an odd emptiness where that golden gaze had been. Her wolf pressed against her consciousness with sudden urgency, because deep down, something had just shifted in ways she couldn't understand. Kira's hands trembled as she approached the command tent. The massive structure loomed before her like a black mouth ready to swallow her whole. Soon after receiving her assignment, she'd been handed a tray of food and wine with curt instructions. "Serve dinner. Don't speak unless spoken to." From there, her nerves had only gotten worse. The tent flaps hung heavy as curtains, muffling the voices inside. What followed was her final moment of hesitation before stepping into the lion's den. Still, she had no choice. Yet even knowing that didn't calm the wild hammering of her pulse. Despite her best efforts to steady herself, the wooden tray shook in her grip. More importantly, she needed to prove Elder Matthias had chosen correctly. In fact, being unremarkable was her only qualification for this position. "Enter," a deep voice commanded from within. Moments later, Kira pushed through the tent flaps. By the time her eyes adjusted to the dim light, her breath had caught in her throat. The Alpha King sat at a rough wooden table, maps spread before him like battle scars. Eventually, her gaze would have found him anyway. He commanded the space like a mountain commands the horizon. But then something impossible happened. Instead of continuing his conversation with the gathered commanders, his words died mid-sentence. Rather than the ongoing discussion about troop movements, absolute silence filled the tent. Meanwhile, every man at the table turned to stare at her. At the same time, she felt the weight of their attention like stones pressing against her chest. Because of her entrance, the most powerful alpha in the realm had gone completely quiet. As a result, she'd somehow disrupted a war meeting, simply by existing. So this was the opposite of being unremarkable. That meant she'd already failed her most basic instruction. Truth be told, she could feel something wrong in the air, an absence where there should have been overwhelming presence. No matter how hard she tried to understand it, his wolf felt gone. Before she could take another step, the Alpha King's golden eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. Without warning, the tray slipped from her nerveless fingers. In that moment, as pewter clattered against the ground and wine soaked into the earth, mortification flooded through her. Then the tent flaps flew open behind her. The scent of roses and ice preceded the newcomer. Rion, Queen Mother Liana said, her voice silk wrapped around steel. Her eyes swept the room, passed over the spilled wine, and landed on Kira like a predator spotting wounded prey. As if fate itself had orchestrated this moment, the queen's gaze didn't just look at Hunted. In one terrifying instant, Kira knew the Queen Mother saw something that made her very, very dangerous. The central square buzzed with evening activity as servants prepared the communal meal. Kira knelt beside a wash basin, scrubbing pots with desperate focus, trying to forget the disaster in the command tent. Soon after her humiliating encounter, she'd been reassigned to the lowest kitchen duties. From there, whispers had followed her like smoke. What followed was 3 days of sideways glances and muffled conversations that died when she approached. Still, she kept her head down and worked. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of those golden eyes. Even so, she tried to convince herself it meant nothing. Despite her best efforts to disappear, someone had been watching her. You. Moments later, Queen Mother Liana's voice cut across the square like a blade. By the time Kira looked up, every conversation had stopped. The Queen Mother stood in the center of the square, her pale beauty sharp as winter ice. That night, Kira would remember how the firelight made Liana look like an avenging angel. "Stand when I address you," Liana commanded. Come morning, everyone in camp would know what happened next. But then, scrambling to her feet with soap-slick hands, Kira only felt terror. Instead of a private scolding, this was a public execution. Rather than discreet punishment, Liana had chosen to destroy her before witnesses. Meanwhile, servants and soldiers gathered in a widening circle. At the same time, their faces showed a mixture of pity and anticipation. 3 days ago, you disrupted a critical war meeting, Liana announced, her voice carrying across the square. Because of her projection, everyone could hear the charges being laid. As a result, murmurs rippled through the crowd. So this wasn't just about dropping a tray. Your clumsiness endangered vital military operations, Liana continued. Such incompetence cannot be tolerated. Which meant Kira's worst fear was confirmed. She'd failed spectacularly at the one thing she was supposed to be good at. Truth be told, the Queen Mother was right. No matter how she tried to justify it, she'd proven herself utterly worthless. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," Kira whispered, her face burning with shame. Maybe if she apologized enough, this nightmare would end. The slap cracked across the square like thunder. She didn't know what stung worse, the physical blow or the dozens of eyes watching her humiliation. Deep down, every whispered word about being unremarkable felt like prophecy coming true. Before she could recover, Liana leaned close. Without warning, her next words made everything clear. "My son will never choose you, little Omega. Remember that when you think yourself special." In that moment, Kira's shame transformed into something deeper and more devastating. Her face burned not from the slap, but from the crushing weight of public disgrace. Dozens of soldiers and servants watched, their eyes filled with pity or scorn. She was a spectacle, a joke, exactly as worthless as Elder Matthias had said. Across the square, unseen by Kira, Rion watched from the shadow of the armory. His jaw clenched, so hard, a muscle jumped, but he remained frozen, a king trapped by his own mother's politics. The supply tent felt like sanctuary after the day's humiliation. Kira had volunteered for the midnight inventory, desperate for solitude and darkness to hide her burning shame. Soon after the evening meal had ended, she'd slipped away from the other servants. From there, counting sacks of grain and barrels of ale had become meditation. What followed was the first peace she'd known since arriving at camp. Still, Liana's words echoed in her mind like a curse. Yet, under cover of darkness, she could almost pretend the public humiliation hadn't happened. Even so, every face in that crowd was burned into her memory. Despite her attempts to focus on work, voices drifted from behind a stack of supply crates. On the other hand, maybe eavesdropping would distract her from her shame. More importantly, the voices sounded familiar. Noble accents that spoke of bloodlines and politics. "The threat must be eliminated," a cold voice said. In fact, Kira recognized that tone immediately. Not only that, but she'd heard it just hours ago in the square. Queen Mother Liana. What's worse, they were discussing eliminating a threat. Moments later, Kira crept closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time she found a gap between crates, she could see 3 figures huddled in whispered conference. Lyanna stood with two noble lords, their faces grim in the torchlight. That night, Kira would realize some conversations were too dangerous to overhear. Come morning, she would understand that knowledge could be a death sentence. But then, pressed against the rough wood, she only felt compelled to listen. I don't care about prophecies, Lyanna continued, her voice cold as steel. I will not have my bloodline tainted by that. Instead of speaking a name, she spat the word like poison. Rather than confusion, terrible understanding began to dawn. Meanwhile, the pieces of a deadly puzzle clicked into place. Find a way, Lyanna ordered. Make it look like an accident. An enemy arrow during the next battle, perhaps. At the same time, one lord nodded. Because of his agreement, Kira knew this wasn't idle talk. As a result, someone was marked for death. So the Queen Mother was planning murder. That's when the horrible truth hit her, which meant she was the threat they were discussing. Truth be told, she'd walked straight into a trap disguised as conscription. No matter how carefully Elder Matthias had explained her selection, someone had wanted her here for reasons that had nothing to do with being unremarkable. Maybe the moon goddess's whispers hadn't been dreams at all. Terror choked her as she backed away from the crates. She didn't know what scared her more, that she was marked for death, or that she finally understood why. Deep down, she was somehow connected to a prophecy that threatened the royal bloodline. Before she could process the full implications, the moon goddess's voice whispered clearer than ever. The prophecy has begun, child, and you are at its heart. Without warning, her ordinary world didn't just crack, it shattered completely. In that moment, Kira realized she wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting against destiny itself. Dawn broke gray and cold over Ironhold Valley, but Kira had already been awake for hours. Sleep felt impossible when every shadow might hide an assassin's blade. Soon after overhearing Lyanna's deadly plot, she'd spent the night huddled in her bedroll, jumping at every sound. From there, morning duties became a careful dance of survival. What followed was the most terrifying realization of her life. She had to act normal while knowing she was marked for death. Still, showing fear would only confirm Lyanna's suspicions about the prophecy. Yet every servant who approached made her heart race. Even so, she forced herself to scrub floors and serve meals with steady hands. Despite her terror, she had to prove she was still just an unremarkable Omega. On the other hand, maybe if she convinced them she posed no threat, they'd leave her alone. More importantly, she needed to understand what prophecy they feared. In fact, the moon goddess had confirmed she was at its heart. Not only that, but Rion's wolf had gone silent around her. What's worse, that silence seemed to be the sign everyone was watching for. You look tired, girl. Moments later, Queen Mother Lyanna appeared beside the wash basins, like a beautiful nightmare. By the time Kira looked up, the queen's pale eyes were studying her with predatory intensity. Lyanna's presence felt like ice water in Kira's veins. That night, she would remember how the Queen Mother's smile never reached her eyes. Come morning, she would realize this was another test. But then, kneeling in soapy water with her hands pruned from endless washing, she only felt trapped. I couldn't sleep, Your Majesty, Kira managed, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Instead of dismissing her, Lyanna crouched down with elegant precision. Rather than towering over her, the Queen Mother brought their faces level. Meanwhile, other servants scattered like startled birds. At the same time, Kira felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention. Bad dreams? Lyanna asked, her tone deceptively gentle. Because of the Queen's interest, Kira's mouth went dry. As a result, she had to choose her words very carefully. Just adjusting to camp life, she whispered. So far, she'd managed not to lie outright. That meant she could still salvage this conversation, which was when Lyanna's smile turned razor sharp. How thoughtful of you to volunteer for extra duties, the Queen continued. Kitchen work, supply runs, cleaning the stables, almost as if you're trying to prove something. Truth be told, Kira had been trying to stay busy and visible, the opposite of suspicious behavior. No matter how she'd reasoned it, constant activity felt safer than hiding. Maybe that had been a mistake. She didn't know what scared her more, that Lyanna was testing her, or that she might be failing the test without knowing the rules. Deep down, survival meant playing a game where one wrong word could mean death. Before she could respond, Lyanna stood with fluid grace. Without warning, her next words sent ice through Kira's bones. Rest well tonight, child. Tomorrow brings 8 new challenges. In that moment, Kira understood the Queen Mother's message perfectly. The accident would happen soon. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Kira hauled water from the camp's well. Her shoulders ached from the heavy buckets, but she welcomed the physical pain as distraction from her spiraling thoughts. Soon after her morning encounter with Liana, paranoia had taken root like poison ivy. From there, every glance felt like surveillance. What followed was the exhausting realization that she couldn't trust anyone in camp. Still, she had to maintain her routine while watching for threats, yet the constant vigilance was wearing her down. Even so, she forced herself to keep working. Despite her best efforts to appear normal, her hands shook when nobles passed too close. On the other hand, maybe trembling was normal for overworked servants. More importantly, she needed to find allies or at least identify enemies. Careful with that bucket. In fact, a deep voice made her spin around so fast water sloshed over the rim. Not only that, but her heart nearly stopped when she saw who had spoken. Alpha King Rion stood 3 paces away, his golden eyes unreadable. What's worse, they were completely alone behind the supply tents. Moments later, her pulse thundered so loud she was sure he could hear it. By the time she found her voice, he'd stepped closer. That night, she would replay every detail of this encounter. Come morning, she would wonder if fate had orchestrated their meeting. But then, faced with his unexpected presence, she could only stammer an apology. Your Majesty, I didn't see you there. Instead of the commanding presence from the tent, something almost vulnerable flickered in his expression. Rather than cold authority, she glimpsed a man carrying burdens she couldn't imagine. Meanwhile, his scent hit her pine and smoke, and something wild that made her wolf stir restlessly. At the same time, she became hyper-aware of how small she felt beside him. Because of his proximity, rational thought became difficult. As a result, she forgot about Liana's threats for one dangerous moment. You've been avoiding the command area, he observed, his voice carefully neutral. So he'd noticed her absence. That meant her attempts at invisibility had failed spectacularly, which was when she remembered she was speaking to the man whose mother wanted her dead. I was reassigned to general duties, she managed, setting down the buckets with trembling hands. Truth be told, she couldn't tell if he was here as king or as the son who'd watched her humiliation without intervening. No matter how she studied his expression, his thoughts remained hidden. Maybe this was another test. She didn't know what scared her more, that he might be part of his mother's plot, or that the way he looked at her made her forget to be afraid. Deep down, something responded to his presence with dangerous recognition. Before she could analyze the feeling, he stepped closer. Without warning, the space between them felt charged like air before a storm. My wolf, he began, then stopped, his jaw clenching. In that moment, Kira realized he was struggling with the same inexplicable connection that had haunted her dreams. His wolf had gone silent around her, and he didn't understand why any more than she did. The training grounds had emptied as dusk settled over Ironhold Valley, but Kira continued collecting water buckets and gear. The distant sound of alarm bells had sent most warriors scrambling to the eastern pass where enemy scouts had been spotted. Soon after Rion had left their charged conversation to join the patrol, an uneasy quiet had fallen over camp. From there, skeleton crews maintained essential duties while the main force investigated the threat. What followed was the kind of tense waiting that made every shadow feel dangerous. Still, water needed hauling and weapons needed cleaning. Yet something felt wrong beyond the normal pre-battle tension. Even so, she forced herself to focus on the familiar rhythm of work. Despite the distant threat, camp life continued. On the other hand, maybe that was exactly when enemies struck when attention was focused elsewhere. More importantly, the moon hung full overhead, and its silver light made her skin tingle with strange energy. Look up, child. In fact, the moon goddess's voice whispered so clearly, Kira nearly dropped her bucket. Not only that, but the command felt urgent in ways she'd never experienced. What's worse, disobeying felt impossible. Moments later, she raised her eyes toward the supply storehouse. By the time her gaze focused, something moved across the roof that shouldn't be there. A shadow, human-shaped but wrong somehow. That night, she would wonder how she'd seen what trained sentries had missed. Come morning, she would understand that her abilities were awakening, whether she wanted them to or not. But then, staring at the figure creeping along the rooftop, she felt absolute certainty flood through her. Instead of questioning the impossible clarity of her vision, her body moved on pure instinct. Rather than calling for help, she watched the shadow draw back a bowstring. Meanwhile, Sergeant Kane walked his patrol route directly below, completely unaware of the danger. At the same time, the arrow would take him through the heart, in 3 heartbeats. Because of her enhanced sight, she could see what others couldn't. As a result, only she could prevent a murder. So this was what the moon goddess had been preparing her for. That meant her unremarkable nature had been a lie from the beginning. Kane, down! Without thinking, Kira hefted the heavy water bucket with both hands, which was when impossible strength flooded through her arms. Truth be told, the bucket should have been too heavy to throw accurately. No matter how she'd reasoned it, what happened next defied normal Omega capabilities. Maybe the moon's power was finally answering her desperation. The bucket flew like a cannonball, striking Kane in the shoulder and sending him stumbling just as the arrow whistled through empty air. She didn't know what shocked her more, that she'd thrown with inhuman force, or that Kane was staring at her with dawning confusion. Deep down, she knew she'd just exposed abilities she barely understood. Before she could process what had happened, shouts erupted as the infiltrator was spotted. Without warning, warriors converged on the storehouse like hunting wolves. In that moment, as the enemy spy was dragged down in chains, Kira realized several people had witnessed her impossible throw. How? Kane approached slowly, his eyes wide. How did you see him from here? Nobody could have spotted him on that roof. Her hands trembled as the truth hit her. I just saw him. As if fate demanded acknowledgement, whispers spread among the remaining soldiers. With every confused glance, she felt her carefully constructed invisibility crumbling. Between one breath and the next, she'd become exactly what she'd spent her life trying not to be remarkable. Across the training grounds, Queen Mother Liana emerged from the shadows where she'd been watching. In the stillness that followed, her cold smile sent ice through Kira's bones. The Queen's eyes didn't hold surprise, they held confirmation. As the moon's light bathed the scene in silver, Kira understood that this hadn't been an enemy attack at all. It had been a test, and she'd just failed it by succeeding. 3 days had passed since the incident at the training grounds, and Kira's world had become a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Queen Mother Liana's new assignments arrived like clockwork, each more dangerous than the last. Soon after dawn, she'd be sent to clean the weaponry, while sharpened blades, accidentally, slipped from their stands. From there, kitchen duty involved handling boiling oil that somehow splashed toward her arms. What followed was stable work, where spooked horses kicked at shadows whenever she approached. Still, she completed every task with shaking hands and growing terror. Yet the attempts on her life remained just subtle enough to seem like accidents. Even so, each near miss sent a clear message: you're living on borrowed time. Despite her heightened senses warning her of every trap, she had no choice but to walk into them. On the other hand, refusing Liana's orders would be openly defiant and grounds for immediate execution. More importantly, witnesses always seemed to be conveniently absent when the accidents occurred. Stable duty, a guard announced, thrusting a lead rope into her hands. In fact, the massive black stallion attached to it was known for its vicious temperament. Not only that, but the beast's eyes rolled white with barely contained fury. What's worse, she could feel Liana's presence watching from the balcony overlooking the stable yard. Moments later, the stallion reared without warning, its iron-shod hooves aimed directly at her head. By the time she realized the danger, there was no time to use her powers, only to brace for impact. That night, she would have been dead if not for divine intervention. Come morning, the camp would buzz with talk of the Alpha King's fury. But then, facing death by crushing hooves, salvation came in the form of a black-clad arm slamming into her ribs. Instead of horse hooves, she hit the stable wall as someone threw her clear. Rather than pain, she felt overwhelming relief as Rion stood between her and the raging stallion. Meanwhile, his fury filled the stable yard like a physical force. At the same time, his golden eyes locked not on the horse, but on the balcony above. "Enough, Mother!" he roared, his voice carrying across the entire yard. Because of his public challenge, every conversation died. As a result, dozens of witnesses saw the Alpha King openly defy his mother. So this was the confrontation Lyanna had been avoiding. That meant the careful political dance was finally over, which left only open warfare between mother and son. Truth be told, the entire stable yard held its breath. No matter what happened next, everyone present would remember this moment. Maybe Lyanna had finally pushed too far. She didn't know what felt more dangerous, the Queen Mother's rage or Rion's protective fury. Deep down, Kira realized she'd just become the prize in a war between two of the most powerful werewolves alive. The moon hung full and silver above her tiny sleeping area, but Kira couldn't close her eyes. Every shadow seemed to shift with potential assassins, and every sound made her heart race with panic. Soon after Rion's public confrontation with his mother, the entire camp had felt ready to explode. From there, sleep had become impossible. What followed was the longest night of her life, until the moon goddess's voice cut through her terror like silver flame. "Daughter, the time has come for truth." Still, Kira had grown used to cryptic whispers and fragments, yet tonight felt different, urgent, and final in ways that made her skin burn. Even so, she tried to resist the pull toward something that felt bigger than survival. Despite her fear, curiosity won. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered to the empty air. On the other hand, maybe understanding would only make the target on her back larger. More importantly, she was already marked for death. What harm could knowledge do now? "Listen well, child of prophecy." The goddess's voice grew stronger, more present than ever before. In fact, power seemed to flow through the words themselves. Not only that, but images began flooding Kira's mind, visions of ancient wolves and forgotten magic. What's worse, she saw herself standing before a massive black wolf whose eyes burned with familiar golden fire. "You are the last Luna," the goddess continued, her voice echoing with divine authority. "Born to unite or destroy every werewolf pack that walks this earth." Moments later, the weight of destiny crashed over her like a tsunami. By the time the vision cleared, her entire worldview had shattered. That night, everything finally made sense in the most terrifying way possible. Come morning, she would understand why Lyanna feared her enough to risk everything. But then, grappling with the enormity of what she'd learned, only one thought consumed her. Instead of being nobody special, she was the most dangerous person alive. Rather than unremarkable, her very existence threatened the balance of power that had stood for centuries. Meanwhile, the prophecy's words burned through her consciousness. The last Luna's choice will either bind all wolves in eternal unity or scatter them to extinction. Even me. At the same time, she understood why Rion's wolf went silent around her. Because of their destined connection, his beast recognized her power before either of them understood it. As a result, every moment they spent together brought the prophecy closer to fulfillment. So, Lyanna's desperation wasn't just about bloodline purity. That meant the Queen Mother was trying to prevent either the end of werewolf freedom or the end of werewolves entirely. Which raised a terrifying question. What if Lyanna was right to fear her? Truth be told, Kira had never asked to hold the fate of entire species in her hands. No matter how she tried to process it, the responsibility felt crushing. Maybe the world would be safer if she simply disappeared. She didn't know what scared her more, the power growing inside her, or the choice she would eventually have to make. Deep down, she finally understood why the moon goddess had called her daughter. Before she could spiral further into her fear, the sound of a war horn shattered the night. Without warning, a deafening shout echoed across the camp. "Siege! The camp is breached!" In that moment, Kira realized the prophecy's timeline had just accelerated beyond anyone's control. Chaos erupted across Ironhold Valley, as enemy forces poured through breaches in the camp's defenses. Kira stumbled from her bedroll into a nightmare of clashing steel and screaming wounded. Soon after the alarm bells began ringing, fires had started burning throughout the camp. From there, the systematic attack became clear. This wasn't random raiding. What followed was her desperate attempt to help while staying out of the warriors' way. Still, injured soldiers needed water and burning tents needed dousing. Yet every time she moved through the battlefield, her eyes searched for one figure. Even so, she told herself it was just practical concern for their leader's safety. Despite the chaos around her, she couldn't stop scanning for Rion's familiar silhouette. On the other hand, Maybe the connection between them made his safety feel essential to her survival. More importantly, something felt wrong about his absence from the front lines. "There!" someone shouted, pointing toward the eastern ridge. In fact, she finally spotted him engaged in brutal combat with 3 enemy warriors. Not only that, but he fought with deadly precision, yet something was missing. What's worse, he moved like a man instead of the legendary Alpha King. Moments later, she realized what was wrong. By the time the truth hit her, her heart nearly stopped. He was fighting with only human strength and steel. That night, she would understand why he seemed vulnerable despite his skill. Come morning, she would replay this moment and wonder if fate had orchestrated everything. But then, watching him barely block a strike that should have been effortless to counter, only terror mattered. Instead of supernatural speed and power, he fought like any mortal warrior. Rather than the unstoppable force of legend, he seemed almost indolent, fragile. Meanwhile, an enemy archer appeared on the ridge above the melee. At the same time, Kira's enhanced vision caught the glint of a drawn bowstring. Because of her lunar sight, she could see what others couldn't, the arrow aimed directly at Rian's exposed back. As a result, she had perhaps 3 heartbeats to choose. So this was the moment the prophecy had been building toward. That meant her decision here would change everything, which was when she stopped fighting her destiny and embraced it. "Ryan!" Her scream tore across the battlefield as silver light erupted from her hands. Truth be told, the power felt like liquid fire pouring through her veins. No matter how she'd tried to hide her nature, desperation finally shattered every barrier. Maybe this was what the moon goddess had been preparing her for all along. The telekinetic blast caught the archer mid-draw, hurling him from the ridge like a broken doll. She didn't know what shocked her more, the raw power she'd unleashed, or how natural it felt. Deep down, she finally understood what she was capable of. Across the battlefield, Rian spun toward her voice, his golden eyes wide with shock and something that looked like recognition. In the stillness that followed her display, their gazes locked across the chaos. Between them, something shifted that had nothing to do with the battle raging around them. As her power settled back into her bones, Kira felt the weight of dozens of stares. But her terror focused on 2 figures she glimpsed on a distant ridge, enemy scouts lowering seeing glasses with satisfied smiles. They weren't shocked by her display. They looked like hunters who'd finally found their prey. The aftermath of battle left Ironhold Valley scarred with smoke and blood, but Kira felt more shaken by what she'd unleashed than by the enemy attack. Her display of power had changed everything in ways that terrified her. Soon after the retreating forces had disappeared, she'd slipped away to a quiet grove beyond the camp's edge. From there, solitude had become her only refuge. What followed was hours of staring at her hands, trying to understand the silver fire that had erupted from her palms. Still, the memory of that raw power made her stomach clench with fear. Yet she couldn't deny that using her abilities had felt about right. Even so, the implications terrified her more than any physical threat. Despite her fear, she needed answers about what was happening to her. On the other hand, maybe some knowledge was too dangerous to seek. More importantly, she felt drawn to pray something she'd never done before arriving at this camp. "Moon goddess," she whispered to the silver orb overhead. "I need to understand what's happening to me." In fact, speaking the words aloud made them feel more real and urgent. Not only that, but power seemed to shimmer in the air around her. What's worse, she could feel something vast and ancient stirring in response to her plea. Moments later, the familiar voice filled her mind stronger and clearer than ever before. By the time the goddess spoke, Kira's skin was glowing with soft lunar radiance. "You seek guidance, daughter. This shows wisdom." That night, she would remember this as the moment she stopped running from her destiny. Come morning, she would understand that some conversations changed everything. But then, faced with divine presence, she could only pour out her desperate questions. The power during the battle, it felt like it could have destroyed everyone if I'd lost control. Instead of reassurance, the goddess's response carried grave warning. Rather than comfort, her words revealed dangers Kira hadn't imagined. "The Shadow Council has been watching, waiting for you to reveal yourself," the goddess explained. "They are alphas who would corrupt the prophecy, use your bond with the Alpha King to control all wolves, rather than unite them." Meanwhile, Understanding crashed over her like ice water. At the same time, she realized her heroic moment had just painted targets on everyone she cared about. Because of her public display, enemies now knew exactly where to find her. As a result, they would come for her and use her connection to Rion as leverage. Then I need to learn to control this, Kira said, her voice strengthening with resolve. I need to train before they arrive. So this was her moment of commitment. That meant no more hiding, no more pretending to be powerless, which was when the goddess's approval washed over her like warm sunlight. Now you begin to understand your true purpose, laughed Luna. Truth be told, Kira had spent her entire life believing she was worthless. No matter how terrifying this new path seemed, it felt better than remaining helpless. Maybe embracing her power was the only way to protect the people she loved. 3 nights after her conversation with the moon goddess, Kira's secret training was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. She'd been practicing in the same grove, learning to call and control the silver light that responded to her will. Soon after discovering she could manifest small shields of lunar energy, confidence had begun replacing her fear. From there, each successful exercise had made her feel more capable. What followed was the most progress she'd made since arriving at camp. Still, she jumped when footsteps approached through the darkness. Yet the familiar scent on the night breeze made her pulse race for entirely different reasons. Even so, she tried to compose herself before Rion emerged from the tree line. Despite her attempts at normalcy, the way he looked at her made rational thought difficult. On the other hand, maybe that was exactly why this conversation was necessary. More importantly, she'd been avoiding him since the battle, and they both knew it. You've been disappearing every night, he said quietly, his golden eyes searching her face. In fact, his tone held concern rather than accusation. Not only that, but the way he studied her suggested he'd been worried. What's worse, she could feel the connection between them humming like a taut wire. I've been thinking, she managed, dismissing the faint glow still clinging to her hands. Moments later, he stepped closer, and she caught his scent on the night air. By the time he spoke again, her carefully constructed defenses were already crumbling. About what happened between us during the battle, he continued. I felt something changed. That night, she would remember how vulnerable he looked in the moonlight. Come morning, she would hate herself for what she was about to do. But then, faced with his growing feelings, only her deepest fears mattered. You felt wrong, she said, the words tearing from her throat. Instead of understanding, his expression shifted to confusion and hurt. Rather than acceptance, he stepped even closer. Kira, what we have isn't real, she interrupted, forcing steel into her voice. Meanwhile, her heart was shattering with every cruel word. At the same time, she made herself continue the devastating lie. Because of her core fear, the words came easier than they should have. You're a king, Rion. I'm nothing. I'm the girl who scrubs floors and spills wine. As a result, she was voicing every terrible thing she'd ever believed about herself. So this rejection was built on the foundation of her deepest wound. That meant Liana had been right all along. Liana was right about me, she whispered, the admission like poison on her tongue. This isn't real. You can't choose me. Which was when she saw something break in his golden eyes. Truth be told, watching pain flicker across his features nearly shattered her resolve. No matter how necessary this felt, destroying his feelings was destroying part of herself. Maybe she was protecting him by proving she wasn't worthy of his love. She didn't know what hurt more, speaking the lie, or how much of it felt like truth. Deep down, she was still the worthless orphan who believed she deserved nothing. Before he could argue or try to convince her otherwise, she turned and fled deeper into the forest. The same night, Kira returned to camp with tears still burning her cheeks and found something terribly wrong. The silence felt unnatural, too complete, too deliberate. Soon after stepping through the perimeter, she realized the usual sounds of night watches and restless sleepers were missing. From there, her enhanced senses began picking up traces that made her blood run cold. What followed was the terrible understanding that enemies had infiltrated while she'd been destroying her own happiness. Still, she moved carefully through the shadows between tents. Yet every step confirmed her worst fears. Even so, she forced herself to investigate rather than run. Despite the danger, she had to know what was happening. On the other hand, Maybe her training session had saved her from whatever fate had befallen the others. More importantly, she could smell foreign wolves, at least 6 distinct scents moving through the camp like ghosts. Shadow Council, she breathed, remembering the moon goddess's warning. In fact, they'd come exactly as predicted. Not only that, but they were moving with supernatural stealth toward the command area. What's worse, they were heading directly for Rion's tent. Moments later, she understood their strategy perfectly. By the time the pieces clicked together, her training in lunar magic suddenly felt inadequate. They weren't here to attack the camp, they were here to capture the Alpha King and use him as leverage against her. That night, she would realize that some choices defined everything that came after. Come morning, there might not be anyone left to remember her decision. But then, faced with the threat to Rion's life, only one option remained. Instead of fleeing or hiding, she had to draw them away from him. Rather than self-preservation, she chose sacrifice. Meanwhile, silver light began building in her palms as she stepped deliberately into the open. At the same time, she made herself as visible as possible. Because of her lunar glow, every Shadow Council member would see her immediately. As a result, their attention would shift from Rion to their primary target. "Looking for me?" she called out, her voice carrying across the silent camp. So this was how she'd protect him, by offering herself as bait. That meant leading them away from everyone she cared about. Which was when 6 figures materialized from the shadows like nightmares taking shape. "There's our little Luna," their leader said, his smile revealing filed teeth. "We've been waiting for you to surface." Truth be told, her plan was working perfectly. No matter what happened to her now, Rion would be safe. Maybe sacrificing herself for his safety was the most worthy thing she'd ever done. She didn't know what scared her more, their predatory confidence, or how easily they'd fallen for her diversion. Deep down, Kira realized she was about to discover what the Shadow Council's corruption truly meant. Before she could retreat further from camp, magical bonds erupted around her wrists like living chains. Without warning, darkness closed in as they overwhelmed her defenses and dragged her into a nightmare from which she might never return. In that moment, as consciousness faded, her last coherent thought was a prayer that her sacrifice would keep Rion safe long enough for him to find another way to fulfill the prophecy. Kira woke to the smell of damp stone and the sound of dripping water echoing through darkness. Her wrists burned from the magical restraints that bound her to a rough stone wall, and her head pounded from whatever they'd used to keep her unconscious during transport. Soon after her eyes adjusted to the dim torchlight, she realized she was in some kind of underground cavern. From there, the scope of her predicament became terrifyingly clear. What followed was the slow understanding that she was no longer anywhere near Ironhold Valley. Still, the Shadow Council's stronghold felt ancient and wrong in ways that made her wolf cower. Yet she forced herself to assess her surroundings with the tactical awareness Rion had unknowingly taught her. Even so, every surface seemed carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Despite her fear, she needed to understand her captor's plans. On the other hand, maybe ignorance would be a mercy compared to the truth. More importantly, she could sense corruption in the very air magic twisted into something dark and hungry. Awake at last! The voice belonged to the filed-tooth leader who'd captured her. In fact, his smile looked even more predatory in the cavern's dancing shadows. Not only that, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone holding all the advantages. What's worse, she could smell at least a dozen other wolves in the passages beyond her prison. "The ritual requires you conscious, little Luna," he continued, approaching with deliberate slowness. "We need your willing participation to corrupt the prophecy properly." Moments later, ice flooded her veins as his words sank in. By the time she found her voice, he was close enough that his breath felt cold against her face. "I'll never help you," she managed, though her voice came out smaller than intended. That night, she would learn exactly how naive that declaration sounded. Come morning, she would understand that some forms of cooperation weren't truly voluntary. But then, faced with his amused laughter, she could only feel her defiance crumbling. Instead of anger at her refusal, he seemed genuinely entertained. Rather than threats, his response carried the casual confidence of someone who'd already won. "Oh, but you will?" he said, tracing one filed tooth with his tongue. "Because if you don't, we'll drag your precious Alpha King here and make you watch while we flay the skin from his bones." Meanwhile, Her heart stopped as the threat hit home. At the same time, she realized her sacrifice had been meaningless. They could still reach Rion whenever they chose. Because of her capture, she'd actually made him more vulnerable, not less. As a result, her noble gesture had backfired spectacularly. So this was how they would break her, not through physical torture, but by threatening the person she loved most. That meant her resistance had just become the weapon they would use against her, which was when she understood that some battles were lost before they even began. Truth be told, she'd walked straight into a trap designed specifically around her greatest weakness. No matter how she'd tried to protect Rion, love itself had become her vulnerability. Maybe that had always been their plan. 3 days of psychological torture had worn Kira's defenses down to nothing. They'd shown her visions through corrupted, scrying magic images of Rion searching for her with desperate determination, while Shadow Council forces stalked his every move. Soon after each session, they would remind her how easily they could end his life. From there, her resolve had begun cracking like a dam under pressure. What followed was the slow realization that resistance might cost more than surrender. Still, she clung to the hope that somehow Ryan would stay safe if she held out long enough. Yet the visions grew more detailed and threatening each day. Even so, she forced herself to endure whatever they showed her. Despite her best efforts to remain strong, exhaustion was taking its toll. On the other hand, maybe wearing her down was exactly what they intended. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the true scope of their corruption. "Today we begin the bonding ritual," the leader announced as he entered her cell. In fact, 2 other Shadow Council members flanked him, both radiating power that felt wrong in ways her wolf instinctively feared. Not only that, but they carried ceremonial implements that reeked of dark magic. What's worse, she recognized some of the symbols from her nightmares about corrupted prophecies. "The false bond will make you our weapon," he explained with satisfied malice. "Once you're tied to our alpha through blood and magic, the prophecy will fulfill itself through our will instead of the moon goddess's design." Moments later, understanding crashed over her like poison. By the time she processed what they intended, true horror had set in. They weren't just planning to use her, they intended to corrupt her very essence until she became something unrecognizable. That night, she would realize this was worse than death. Come morning, there might not be enough of her left to remember who she used to be. But then, faced with the approach of magical violation, something inside her rebelled. Instead of submission, fury began building like wildfire in her chest. Rather than despair, the moon goddess's power stirred to life. Meanwhile, silver light began flickering around her bound wrists. At the same time, she felt her connection to lunar magic strengthening rather than weakening. "The moon protects her own," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were hers or the goddess's. Because of her resistance, the air began crackling with conflicting energies. As a result, the Shadow Council's confidence flickered for the first time since her capture. So they hadn't expected her to grow stronger in captivity. That meant their ritual might not work as smoothly as planned, which was when their leader's expression shifted from satisfaction to cruel determination. "Then we'll break that connection first," he snarled, raising a blade that seemed to drink light from the air. Truth be told, Kira finally understood that some violations left scars on the soul itself. No matter how the ritual ended, she would never be the same person who'd been captured. Maybe that was what terrified her most, not dying, but surviving as something twisted beyond recognition. She didn't know what would be left of her when they finished. Deep down, she began to believe that death might be a mercy compared to what they had planned. The dark of the moon brought the deepest despair Kira had ever known. For 7 days, they'd attempted the bonding ritual with increasingly brutal methods, but something kept interfering with their magic. Soon after each failure, their anger had grown more vicious. From there, the psychological torture had escalated beyond anything she'd imagined possible. What followed was the complete erosion of hope, as she realized no rescue was coming. Still, she'd held on to the belief that her sacrifice had meant something. Yet tonight, in the absence of the moon's light, even that comfort had abandoned her. Even so, she tried to find strength in memories of better times. Despite her efforts, the darkness felt absolute in ways that went beyond mere lack of light. On the other hand, maybe giving up would end the pain faster. More importantly, she was beginning to wonder if everyone who'd ever claimed to care about her had been lying. The moon has abandoned you, her captor whispered through the bars of her cell. In fact, his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd finally broken his victim completely. Not only that, but the words felt true in ways that made her soul ache. What's worse, she could no longer hear the goddess's voice, just empty silence where comfort used to be. Your precious Alpha King has given up the search, he continued, his lies mixing with her deepest fears. He's already choosing a new mate from among the noble families. Moments later, despair crashed over her like a black tide. By the time the full weight of isolation hit her, she felt herself fragmenting. Maybe she really was as worthless as she'd always believed. That night, she would confront the possibility that her entire existence had been a mistake. Come morning, there might not be enough left of her to care about prophecies or destinies or the fate of any werewolf pack. But then, alone in the absolute darkness, she faced the truth she'd been avoiding. Instead of a chosen hero, she was just a broken girl who'd been deluding herself about her importance. Rather than the last Luna, she was nobody special who'd somehow stumbled into events too large for her to handle. Meanwhile, every person who'd died because of her presence felt like another weight crushing her spirit. At the same time, she realized that Liana had been right all along. Because of her arrogance in thinking she mattered, people she cared about had suffered. As a result, the world would have been better off if she'd never been born. So this was what she deserved, to die alone and forgotten in the darkness, having accomplished nothing but pain. That meant the prophecy itself had been wrong about her worth, which was when the last spark of fight finally died in her chest. Truth be told, she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she wasn't worthless. No matter how hard she'd struggled, the evidence was overwhelming. Maybe the Shadow Council was doing the world a favor by stopping her before she could cause more damage. She didn't know why she'd ever believed she could be anything more than the nobody Elder Matthias had described. Deep down, in the darkest corner of her soul, Kira finally surrendered to the terrible certainty that she would die as she'd lived utterly alone and completely forgettable. Before consciousness could slip away entirely, one last thought echoed through the emptiness. Perhaps this was always how her story was meant to end. In the crushing silence that followed, she stopped fighting altogether and let the darkness claim what was left of her spirit. In the deepest darkness, when hope felt like a forgotten dream, a sound reached through Kira's despair. Howling, distant but unmistakable, carrying a note of grief and fury that made her broken spirit stir. Soon after, the first mournful cry faded. Another followed closer this time. From there, recognition hit her like lightning. What followed was the impossible realization that someone was coming for her after all. Still, she tried to convince herself it was just another hallucination born of desperation. Yet the howls continued, growing stronger and more determined with each passing moment. Even so, she was afraid to believe in rescue after so many days of abandonment. Despite her fear of hoping again, something deep inside her began responding to that familiar call. On the other hand, maybe she was finally losing her mind completely. More importantly, the sound carried emotions she recognized: anguish, determination, and something that felt like love refusing to give up. "No!" her captor snarled from beyond the bars. "He can't have tracked us here." In fact, panic had replaced the confidence in his voice. Not only that, but she could hear other Shadow Council members shouting orders throughout the cavern complex. What's worse for them, the howling was getting closer with each passing minute. Moments later, understanding crashed over her like sunrise. By the time the truth fully hit her, tears were streaming down her face. Rion had never stopped searching. That night, she realized how completely the Shadow Council's lies had poisoned her thoughts. Come morning, she would understand that love had been calling to her all along. She'd just been too broken to hear it. But then, listening to his voice carry through stone and darkness, something shifted inside her chest. Instead of the worthless girl who'd given up, she felt the first spark of her true self returning. Rather than the nobody she'd believed herself to be, she remembered who she'd been before the torture began. Meanwhile, the moon goddess's voice whispered for the first time in days. "The wolf calls to his moon, daughter. Will you answer?" At the same time, she felt power beginning to stir in her bones, not the corrupted magic the Shadow Council had tried to force on her, but her own pure lunar connection. Because of Rion's relentless search, she was remembering that she wasn't alone. As a result, the darkness that had seemed absolute was beginning to crack. So his love had reached her even in the deepest despair. That meant the bond between them was stronger than any prison or torture. Which was when she understood that their connection transcended normal werewolf bonds entirely. Truth be told, he was calling not just to her body, but to her soul. No matter how broken she felt, part of her would always recognize that voice. Maybe she hadn't been abandoned after all. She didn't know what filled her more gratitude that he'd found her, or terror about what he would have to face to reach her. Deep down, Kira realized that if she was going to be worthy of his faith, she had to find the strength to fight back. The sound of battle erupted through the cavern complex as Kira focused on rebuilding her shattered connection to lunar magic. Rion's howls had been joined by others. His pack had come with him into this nightmare. Soon after the first clash of combat echoed through stone passages, she'd begun the most important fight of her life. From there, reclaiming her power felt like pulling herself up from a bottomless pit. What followed was the slow, agonizing process of reconnecting with the goddess's light. Still, every small success felt like a victory against the darkness that had consumed her. Yet she could hear her captors rallying their forces to repel the rescue attempt. Even so, she forced herself to keep building strength, rather than succumbing to fear for Rion's safety. Despite the chaos around her, she had to believe he could handle himself long enough for her to break free. On the other hand, maybe her faith in him was all she had left. More importantly, she finally understood what the prophecy had been trying to tell her. "I am the last Luna," she whispered to the empty air, testing the words that had once terrified her. In fact, speaking her destiny aloud made power flare through her veins like molten silver. Not only that, but she felt the moon goddess's approval even though no moon was visible in this underground prison. What's worse for her captors, the magical restraints began to crack under pressure from her awakening abilities. "I am worthy of love," she continued, each word becoming a declaration of war against the lies she'd believed. Moments later, the bonds around her wrists shattered completely. By the time she stood on shaking legs, silver light was pouring from her skin like liquid starfire. That night, she would remember this as the moment she finally chose to embrace everything she was. Come morning, the Shadow Council would learn what happened when they tried to cage the moon itself. But then, feeling power surge through her with intoxicating intensity, only one goal mattered. Instead of running or hiding, she was going to fight her way to Rion's side. Rather than being rescued, she would rescue herself and help him escape this place. Meanwhile, the sounds of battle were getting closer and more desperate. At the same time, she realized he was fighting his way through dozens of enemies to reach her. Because of his determination, she had to be ready when he arrived. As a result, she began gathering every scrap of lunar magic she could channel. So this was what it meant to be the last Luna, not just power, but the courage to use it. That meant the prophecy's fulfillment depended on her choice to fight rather than surrender, which was when she understood that love and power were meant to work together, not against each other. Truth be told, Rion's faith in her had given her the strength to believe in herself. No matter how the coming battle ended, she would face it as his equal. Maybe that was what the moon goddess had been preparing her for all along. She didn't know what felt more dangerous, the power building in her chest, or how ready she was to unleash it. Deep down, Kira realized she was about to become exactly what the Shadow Council feared most, a Luna who refused to be controlled. The cavern tunnels became a gauntlet of silver fire and shattered stone as Kira fought her way toward freedom. Every step took her closer to the sounds of battle raging above, and every enemy that tried to stop her learned what happened when they faced a Luna defending her mate. Soon after breaking free from her cell, she'd begun carving a path of destruction through the Shadow Council's stronghold. From there, her power had only grown stronger. What followed was the most dangerous running battle of her life, as she blasted through corridors filled with desperate enemies. Still, nothing would stop her from reaching Rion before it was too late. Yet she could feel his exhaustion through their bond, a weariness that spoke of someone who'd been fighting far too long without his wolf's strength. Even so, his determination burned like a beacon, guiding her through the maze of passages. Despite the enemies blocking her path, she pressed forward with relentless fury. On the other hand, maybe fury was exactly what the prophecy required. More importantly, she could sense him above, still fighting, still searching, still refusing to give up. "He needs me," she whispered, as another telekinetic blast cleared 3 Shadow Council warriors from her path. In fact, The bond between them was pulling her forward like an invisible rope. Not only that, but she could feel his silent wolf calling to her Luna through dimensions of connection she barely understood. What's worse, his human form was reaching its limits against supernatural opponents. Moments later, she reached a spiral staircase carved into living rock. By the time she began climbing toward the surface, her power was burning through her veins like liquid moonlight. That night, she would emerge as the Luna she'd always been meant to be. Come morning, the werewolf world would witness the prophecy's fulfillment. But then, racing upward toward the sounds of clashing steel and howling wolves, only one thought consumed her. Instead of being rescued, she would claim her place at Rion's side as his equal. Rather than seeking salvation, she was bringing it with her. Meanwhile, she could feel the moon's presence growing stronger with each step toward the surface. At the same time, understanding crystallized about what she had to do. Because of everything she'd endured, she finally accepted her own worth completely. As a result, she was ready to offer herself as Rion's mate before the entire werewolf world. So this was what the prophecy had been preparing her for, not just survival, but the courage to claim her destiny publicly. That meant the blood moon above would witness the moment that changed everything, which was when she burst from the cavern entrance and stumbled into the night air. Her heart stopped as she took in the scene before her. Truth be told, the sight was both more beautiful and more terrible than anything she could have imagined. The blood moon hung high overhead, bathing the world in crimson light. No matter how many battles she'd envisioned, nothing had prepared her for this. Maybe this was what destiny looked like when it finally arrived. A massive battlefield stretched across the grassy plain, Rion's forces clashing with the Shadow Council, in a war that would determine the future of all werewolves. Deep down, she knew this was the moment the entire prophecy had been building toward. And in the center of it all, she saw him, Rion, fighting in human form, his sword a blur as he held off 3 alphas at once. Before she could move to help him, her blood turned to ice at what else she saw. Watching from a rise overlooking the battle, with cold smiles and patient confidence, stood Queen Mother Liana and the Shadow Council's leaders waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Under the blood moon's crimson light, Kira stepped onto the battlefield and felt destiny settle around her shoulders like a crown. The clash of steel and snarls of combat created a symphony of war, but her focus narrowed to one figure fighting desperately in the center of the chaos. Soon after spotting Rion surrounded by 3 Shadow Council alphas, she understood that this was her moment of ultimate choice. From there, everything she'd endured had led to this single heartbeat. What followed was the most important decision in werewolf history. Still, her steps across the bloodied grass felt steady and sure. Yet every eye on the battlefield began turning toward her as silver light poured from her skin like liquid starlight. Even so, she walked forward with absolute certainty. Despite the danger surrounding them, she felt no fear, only the crushing weight of love and prophecy, demanding fulfillment. On the other hand, maybe that weight was exactly what she'd been born to carry. More importantly, this was where she chose to embrace everything she was, publicly and without reservation. Enough! Her voice rang across the battlefield, carrying power that made every wolf friend and enemy alike freeze in place. In fact, the sheer force of her lunar magic brought the entire war to a standstill. Not only that, but even Queen Mother Liana's confident expression flickered with something that looked like fear. What's worse for her enemies, Kira was no longer the broken girl they'd tried to corrupt. "I am Kira Ashworth," she declared, her voice echoing with divine authority. "Last Luna, daughter of the moon goddess, and I claim Rion Blackthorn as my mate before all witnesses." Moments later, she reached Rion's side and placed her hand on his chest. By the time their skin touched, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. That night, the prophecy would finally be fulfilled, through an act of love rather than force. Come morning, every werewolf pack would know that unity had triumphed over division. But then, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm, only their bond mattered. Instead of words, she poured everything into her touch, her love, her acceptance of their destiny, and her absolute belief in their worthiness. Rather than hesitation, she offered herself completely. Meanwhile, his golden eyes widened as power began flowing between them like electricity. At the same time, something that had been broken inside him started healing. Because of her complete acceptance, his wolf didn't just return, it exploded to life with more power than ever before. As a result, the silent king became something magnificent and terrible. So this was what the prophecy had promised, not just individual strength, but unity that transcended anything either could achieve alone. That meant their love was the key that unlocked everything, which was when Rion's transformation began, and Kira felt her own power magnifying beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Truth be told, they were becoming something new together. Luna and Alpha joined in perfect harmony. No matter what enemies stood against them, nothing could break what they'd just created. Maybe this was what it meant to change the world through the simple act of choosing love over fear. She didn't know what felt more overwhelming, the power flowing through their bond, or the way he looked at her like she was his salvation. Deep down, Kira realized they weren't just mates anymore, they were the fulfillment of every hope the moon goddess had ever held for her children. The wave of unity magic that erupted from their bond swept across the battlefield like wildfire, touching every werewolf present with irresistible force. Shadow Council alphas who'd been snarling with bloodlust suddenly found themselves on their knees, their wolves submitting to power older and deeper than politics or ambition. Soon after the magic reached them, even the most defiant enemies felt the compulsion to acknowledge their new rulers. From there, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What followed was the sight of wolves from every pack, former enemies, neutral observers, and allies alike bowing in perfect synchronization. Still, this wasn't forced submission but recognition of something fundamental and true. Yet Queen Mother Liana remained standing, her face twisted with fury and disbelief. Even so, her defiance felt hollow against the tide of change washing over the battlefield. Despite her rage, the political power she'd wielded for decades was crumbling like sand. On the other hand, maybe she finally understood that fighting prophecy was always futile. More importantly, her son was no longer hers to control. "This is impossible," Liana breathed, her voice carrying across the sudden stillness. In fact, watching her carefully constructed world collapse seemed to age her before everyone's eyes. Not only that, but several noble families who'd supported her were already shifting their allegiance. What's worse for her cause, the moon goddess's magic was still flowing through Kira and Rion, making their authority undeniable. "Mother!" Rion's voice carried new harmonics deeper and more resonant than ever before, touched by his fully awakened wolf. Moments later, he stepped forward with Kira at his side, and every werewolf present felt the rightness of their partnership. By the time he spoke again, even Liana seemed smaller in the face of their combined presence. "The old ways are ended," he continued, his tone holding both finality and unexpected gentleness. "There will be no more division between Alpha, Beta, and Omega. The prophecy has spoken, and we will unite all packs under one banner." That night, the werewolf world would remember this as the moment everything changed. Come morning, news of their bonding would spread to every corner of the realm. But then, watching ancient prejudices dissolve under the weight of divine will, Kira felt a profound sense of completion. Instead of the worthless girl who'd scrubbed floors, she stood as queen to every werewolf in existence. Rather than hiding her nature, she was finally free to be everything she'd been born to become. Meanwhile, former enemies approached with heads bowed, seeking forgiveness and acceptance into their new order. At the same time, she felt Rion's steady presence beside her, no longer fighting alone but sharing every burden. Because of their bond, ruling wouldn't be a lonely burden but a shared joy. 3 months later, Kira stood on the balcony of the rebuilt palace, watching werewolf packs from across the continent gather for the first Unity Festival. The sight still took her breath away, wolves who'd been enemies for generations, now working together to construct new settlements and trade agreements. Soon after their bonding, the transformation of werewolf society had proceeded faster than anyone had dared hope. From there, the practical work of building unity had begun. What followed was the most fulfilling period of Kira's life as she and Rion worked to establish new laws that valued every wolf, regardless of birth rank. Still, some days the responsibility felt overwhelming. Yet watching former outcasts find homes and purpose made every challenge worthwhile. Even so, she sometimes marveled at how much had changed. Despite occasional setbacks, their kingdom was thriving in ways that proved the prophecy's wisdom. On the other hand, maybe unity had always been possible, it just needed the right catalyst. More importantly, she'd learned that being worthy had nothing to do with others' opinions, and everything to do with choosing to believe in herself. Regrets? Rian's voice came from behind her, warm with the affection that had only grown deeper over the months. In fact, his presence still sent butterflies through her stomach like they were new mates, instead of bonded rulers. Not only that, but their connection had continued strengthening in ways that amazed them both. "Never," she said, leaning back against his chest as his arms came around her. What's worse for their old enemies, every day of their reign proved that love was indeed more powerful than fear. Moments later, she felt their child stir within her, the heir who would grow up in a world where worth wasn't determined by birth rank. By the time their daughter was born, she would inherit a kingdom built on unity rather than division. That night, Kira would give thanks to the moon goddess for the journey that had brought her here. Come morning, she would wake as she did every day, not as the worthless orphan she'd once believed herself to be, but as a queen who'd learned to see her own value. But then, surrounded by the evidence of positive change, she reflected on the girl who'd once thought herself invisible. Instead of hiding from her destiny, she'd embraced it completely. Rather than believing others' definitions of her worth, she'd learned to define herself. Meanwhile, the sound of laughter drifted up from the festival below, children playing games that mixed traditions from every pack. At the same time, she felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. Because of their choices, future generations would never know the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. So this was what the prophecy had really promised, not just political unity, but the healing of ancient wounds through the simple power of believing everyone deserved love and acceptance. That meant her transformation from servant to queen was really about learning that she'd always possessed the power to choose her own worth. Truth be told, the moon goddess had been right all along. She was special, not because of magic or prophecy, but because she'd found the courage to love herself. 5 years later, Luna Queen Kira held her daughter against her chest as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Little Camila had Rian's golden eyes but her mother's fierce spirit, and at 3 years old, she was already showing signs of unprecedented magical abilities that suggested the next generation would be even more remarkable. Soon after her first birthday, it had become clear that she was inheriting the best of both bloodlines. "Tell me about the old days, Mama," Camila said in the way children always did when sensing story time. From there, Kira's mind drifted back to a frightened girl who'd once believed she was nobody special. "Once upon a time," she began, settling more comfortably in her chair, "there was a girl who thought she was invisible." What followed was the familiar ritual of sharing their family's history not as legend or prophecy, but as the very real journey of learning to believe in oneself. Still, she always marveled at how far they'd all come, yet the most important lesson remained the same. "But she wasn't really invisible, was she, Mama?" Camila asked, already knowing the answer. "No, little moon," Kira replied, pressing a kiss to her daughter's dark hair. She was just waiting to learn that she'd been shining all along. Deep down, Kira understood that this was the real magic, not the power to move objects or speak with goddesses, but the ability to help others see their own light. And in the distance, Rian's voice carried on the evening breeze as he returned from patrol, calling them both home with the love that had transformed everything.